us through their report. And thank you. So it's good morning for another few minutes. Dr. Pearce, before it becomes afternoon, welcome. And I'll hand over to you to introduce your visitor. And welcome, Mr. Newman. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, councillors. So on my right is Trevor Robinson, who's been the barrister who's been counsel acting for HBRIC in the Board of Inquiry hearings and in other matters. So I'm hoping we won't get down to a level of nuts and bolts about the legal technicalities where we need to have Mr. Robinson partake in the discussion. But if we get there, we get there, and he will partake in the discussion around the RWSS consents to the extent that we need to do that. I'd like to say thanks to Matt Conway for his clear presentation around the RWSS consents and other matters, and I will be referring back to his paper that's been under discussion with you when we turn to that. I'll speak to the revaluation of the Napier Port. Briefly, there's another item on your agenda. I know about that, and we'll be here for that if you need us. I will do the primary talking around the RWSS consents matter. Andrew may well chip in as well, but then the questions, the matters around uptake and other aspects of the RWSS, Andrew will speak to those. The other matter which is in our report is that the statement of intent is finalised and printed, and I understand that councillors have all received copies of that along with your agenda papers, but we will have a pile of those here for anybody who would like, and the members of the public who would like to take a copy away later on today. So just very briefly on the Port of Napier, revaluation of the Port of Napier has been undertaken as part of the revaluation of HBRIC, and that was led in a process by Mr. Drury to have a consistent set of valuations of the council's investment in HBRIC and HBRIC's financial investment in the Port of Napier. You have a recommendation for us, which you will deal with later, I guess, is that the port value be revalued at the midpoint of the range of the valuations. That is the recommendation of the valuers, to adopt the midpoint, and we have adopted their recommendation in our recommendation to you. That is, in rough numbers, a $60 million increase in the value of the port in our investment. On a like-for-like basis, though, the midpoint valuation was not used last time. It was a council decision to use the low point of the valuation, not an HBRIC decision, and that was tied up with the process of creating HBRIC. On a like-for-like basis, if the midpoint valuation had been used the last time, then the uplift in value would be around $40 million, not $60 million, from 200 to 240. Irrespective of which of those numbers we want to choose, I think this reflects extremely well on the port's management and its governance and the successful operation of the report. I'm happy to take questions about that point now if you want to, Chair.
So any questions on that, Councillor Graham?
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, because I was wondering about that. Was the same, just point 8, valued at the council's policy for valuing shareholding, was the same fundamental used?
Yes, it was a DCF valuation, sorry, discounted cash flow valuation in both cases, undertaken by the same party, as I understand it.
And Chairman, I'd just add too that in both valuations, the previous one as well as this one, that cross-referenced that DCF valuation on the basis of multiples. So same process, same team.
Further questions on the report? For now, thank you. Let's move on.
Sorry, just
Oh.
one other. Could you just very briefly explain what enterprise value means?
It's the total value of the business from which debt needs to be deducted in order to get the value of the shares.
Thank you.
It's probably not exactly precise accounting definition, but it's close enough for today. So, can I turn to the next
Please.
topic? So the next question then is the workability of the RWSS consents, and clearly we are recommending to you today that you determine that condition precedent 1, which is about workable EPA resource consents, has been achieved subject only to confirmation by other investors, and noting that the confirmation by those other investors will be confirmed at the time when we recommend preferred investors to you, and we expect that to be in October. And I just want to work my way through the set of points that are laid out here as to why we believe the consents are workable. The first point is that there's a...
Just as a process point, that was a paper that we had to endorse the valuation of HBRIC.
That's the next
Oh, is
next
that the
paper.
one?
Next paper,
Okay,
and
sorry.
specific.
Sorry to interrupt your...
No,
Brilliant.
and a specific recommendation. So yeah, we'll deal with that.
So the first point here, and I'll take questions about this when I get to the end of this point, and I'll do that in relation to each of the other points, is that there's a very comprehensive set of land use conditions alone for the RWSS as part of its global consent. Those consent conditions run to about 22 pages. They're extremely comprehensive. They have requirements about farm environmental management plans, auditing of those plans, the requirement that the council approves the templates for the plans and approves the auditors of those plans, approves the models that are used to assess things in terms of those conditions, and approves the modelling approach. So if I turn to some of the questions that were being asked in the latter part of the last discussion, Council has a quite significant role in ensuring that the tools that are being used here, if you like, are ones that use the best science and the right people are doing the right kind of work. So Council has a degree of oversight and to some degree approval and control of those tools. I'm reasonably familiar from other roles that I have about the range of consent conditions required for other irrigation schemes in New Zealand, particularly those in Canterbury, and it's my view that the set of conditions that are required of the RWSS and its users are the most comprehensive. There certainly isn't anything more comprehensive, and of any irrigation scheme in New Zealand. We are of the firm view that the scheme can live with all of those conditions because they are, in fact, the conditions that were proposed by the RWSS to the Board of Inquiry. They are barely disturbed by the findings of the Board of Inquiry. There are some additions in Condition 11C and 12A, which we'll turn to later about the specific workability of those. But this broad set of conditions, we are comfortable that they are workable and that they will generate significant environmental improvements in management, in fact, on many of those farms. So I'm happy to take questions, if you like, about point A, or do we want to move on?
Oh, keep going, I think.
There are not just land use consents, there are consents about water take and water use, which are part of the bundle of 15 resource consents under the Regional Council. And those include matters such as the dam having to release minimum flows and releasing additional flows to ensure that existing consent holders are made whole in the face of increases in minimum flows to the river, and there is not an economic impact on those. Again, those were advanced, proposed by the RWSS, and they remain in the set of conditions, and it's our view that they are entirely workable. The third point, which is C, the conditions for the RWSS do not require that the RWS comply with a DIN target of 0.8 milligrams per litre by December 2030. In Mr Conway's paper in front of you, in his paragraphs 33 and 38, confirms that that is the case, including not requiring compliance with that DIN limit after 2030, set out in both his paragraphs 33 and 38. The board's reasoning about what farmers and resource consent holders have to comply with is set out in their 2014 final decision, as set out in the paper here in paragraph 449 and repeated in paragraph 86 of their 2015 final decision. And we quote here the last bullet point in each of those paragraphs. It is then clear that the responsibility of the farmer is simply to comply with the LUC root zone leaching rates set in a resource consent, i.e. in the resource consent for the RWSS in this case, or as permitted by Rule TT1. In addition though, in regard to the RWSS, and this is our point E, the 2015 final decision includes new conditions in the RWSS, condition 11C and 12A, that relate to DIN limits and targets, in addition to meeting those LUC leaching rate limits. Condition 12A is the one that requires land upstream of a specific measurement point be managed in a manner consistent with achieving the DIN limits and targets in table 5.9.1b by the 31st of December 2030. It also requires that specific actions for management, for that management in a manner consistent with achieving, are to be identified by the consent holder. In this case, it is the operating entity of the RWSS, in that they be communicated to those landowners upstream and to the regional council. Condition 11C is the one that triggers condition 12A. And it triggers that condition 12A only if the measurements of DIN for a 5-year rolling average show that it's likely that the RWSS activities are a material, i.e. significant, which is the word that the board uses, contributor to any exceedance of the DIN limits and targets, and otherwise condition 12A does not come into effect. Again, that is supported, our view of that is supported by Mr Conway's paragraph 41.
So can I just...
Yes, happy to take questions now.
So the HBRIC view, if we go back to that diagram I'll put up on the whiteboard, the HBRIC view is that in 2023, by which time you won't have a 5-year rolling average, if the DIN is exceeded at the nearest downstream measuring point, that doesn't trigger any immediate remedial action on the part of the consent holder.
So let me address first that this is a reasonably unrealistic scenario for the catchment as it currently stands, because your scenario here has both monitoring point A and monitoring point B being at 0.8 before the scheme starts. That is only true for 2 points in the whole of the catchment at the present time. Almost all of the catchment already exceeds the limits. So a before RWSS scenario below the limit and a post RWSS scenario where it is now above the limit is most unlikely to occur because we are already above beforehand. The second point is that the measure is specifically a rolling 5-year average. Even taking that into account, in a more realistic scenario than the one that you have here, where both points are above, if there was a dramatic increase post the RWSS in a downstream measuring point, the consent holder would have to determine for itself whether or not the RWSS activities was a material contributor to that exceedance. If it was a dramatic increase or a dramatic change in the trend, then logical conclusions would be drawn, I guess. But as Mr. Conway points out, what's an exceedance, a material exceedance, is a matter of fact and judgment to be determined under the specific set of circumstances in a particular place and a particular time.
Yeah, okay, so my question, which you haven't actually answered, is would that only apply after you have the 5-year rolling average? And if there was a material increase, because that's what the rules talk about, in measuring point B, and let's say it went from, I don't know, 1.6 to 2.5 or whatever, before the 5-year rolling average time came around, would you say that HBRIC has no, or sorry, the scheme operator has no requirement to do anything because the 5 years hasn't yet been reached?
The scheme operator would have to determine on a reasonable basis whether or not it had made a material contribution to that. I can't give you a more definitive answer than that. It would have to determine first whether or not a material contribution had been made. If it determined that a material contribution had been made, and it has to decide either of those things on a reasonable basis. If it decided the second, that a material contribution had been made, then it would have to do what is required under condition 12A and identify specific actions that would need to be taken.
If I could
There's quite a few ifs in that sentence.
If I could add to that, I think that to me this demonstrates the value of developing this procedural guideline to lay out how we would approach this, to remove some of the ifs.
And again, in Mr. Conway's advice, he gives some quite useful matters that should be considered in determining what is material in a particular situation. And I think they're probably a very good starting point, both for the council and for the RWSS operator to form a view about, well, what will it use to determine materiality.
Supplementary question of this, it's a minor point, but I see here that we're talking about a 5-year rolling average, and I was intrigued to try and find out when the 5-year rolling average started. And Mr. Conway made the point that the operator, RWSS, has to start its monitoring program 24 months before the scheme begins. So if the scheme began in, say, 2020, let's say for argument, 24 months prior to that would mean that Peter Bevan's example of 2023 would be the beginning of the 5-year rolling average. Is that correct?
So, again, I'll ask my advisor to chip in here if I've got this wrong. So, yes, measurements need to be made starting in 2018 in the example that you're talking about. In fact,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
The qualification to that is that there are some existing monitoring points where HBRC is already collecting data. So the specific RWSS monitoring points, the new ones, will start in 2018, but there are other monitoring points that are being monitored right now. And if I could, with your leave, Mr. Chair, returning to Councillor Bevan's question, the sequence is you first have to decide whether there is an exceedance. If you don't have 5 years of data, you do not have, as a matter of law, an exceedance of the DIN limit, because you don't. But as I say, because there are existing monitoring points, RWSS will be filling in the gaps, but there is already a bundle of data available.
Can I just follow up on that question, please? Just with respect, you haven't answered the question whether the HBRC has monitoring points is not the question. What my question was is about when does the 5-year rolling average start that we've got the data. Now my question was, given that we're advised by Matt that the RWSS is required to have monitoring done 24 months before the dam becomes operative, then if, for example, the dam is operative on 2020, the 24 months of monitoring prior to that would be 2018, so therefore the first period which the 5-year rolling average would be complete would be 2023, which is 3 years after the dam has been operative. Is that correct? Is the logic of that correct?
The logic of that, as I understand it, is correct, but whether or not you can make a judgment about a material contribution occurring between 2020 and 2023 is more difficult, because 2 of the 5 years of data relate to a period when the RWSS and its activities were not in existence.
I was just interested in these monitoring points. We've got a number of monitoring points, maybe 12 or something, I think, or 20 currently? 12 or something. I'm assuming that there is a proposal to increase the number of monitoring points?
So again, if I can address that, the measurement points that are for which condition 11C refers to are set out in the basket of land use conditions. And it is only those points where DIN measurements are relevant to conditions 11C and 12A.
So,
and how many are there?
There's about
off
18
the top of
of
my
them.
head, it's a large, I can't tell you, but it's a large number. The list takes up most of a page in the conditions.
So yes, Dr. Pearce is correct that they have a schedule that lays out their monitoring points. Council
That's
has its own.
Specifically for RWSS
specifically
or just generally?
Specifically for RWSS consents and the 11C and 12A, so they're referenced to those conditions.
Yeah.
We also have our own monitoring network, which we, as part of our policy implementation work, will be revisiting and reviewing to say, is it still fit for purpose given the new policy and given the operators in the catchment? So there'll be 2 lots of monitoring, if you like, albeit we wouldn't obviously, monitor the same points on the same days as these guys. We'll be looking for efficiency.
So the precise answer, which my colleague has helpfully given me, having turned to the correct page in the conditions, is 20.
20, okay. So just out of interest, are they automated or, are they expensive to?
Yeah, our ones aren't automated, are they? We do have some. We have automated flow sites, but water quality is more problematic in terms of automating and putting loggers in there. But that technology is changing all the time. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we sample monthly, which is seen as best practice for saving costs.
But we're still at the point where we've got to go and gather a sample of water from a particular spot and then go and get it analysed.
Correct.
And all of that cost is carried by the RWSS for the DIN monitoring, because that is part of the conditions. RWSS carries the cost of all of the monitoring required, not just for DIN, but for nitrate nitrogen, total ammoniacal nitrogen, total nitrogen, dissolved organic, dissolved inorganic, turbidity, DRP, that's phosphorus, total phosphorus, organic phosphorus, E. coli, MCI, periphyton biomass, horizontal visibility, pH, conductivity, temperature, dissolved oxygen concentration, periphyton cover and deposited sediment cover at each of these locations.
Just to clarify, that's the operator has to carry the costs
some
of
are monthly and some are annual.
Yeah, so the operator carries those costs for its monitoring under its conditions. Council also operates its own monitoring and we pay for that.
Can we keep moving? So there's a range of possible scenarios of the kind that Councillor Bevan has drawn on the board, and I will turn to some that we have considered about workability in a moment. Our point H is that the RWSS cannot be the only party responsible for achieving the DIN limits and targets by 2030. And that point is also supported by Mr Conway's paragraph 40. And here I do want to reflect upon some wording that Mr Conway used in his oral presentation. I believe he said that the RWSS must ensure that the DIN limits are achieved by 2030. I'm sure he didn't mean to say that because it isn't correct. What is correct is that the RWSS must manage in a manner that is consistent with achieving those. So the RWSS, if you think about it at 25,000 hectares, is around 10% of the total catchment area. If it were 40,000 hectares, which is pretty unlikely, it would be 15 or 16% of the total catchment area. No action taken by the RWSS on its own could achieve the DIN limits, given that they are exceeded throughout the catchment. Other parties must take up their share of the process of reducing the current DIN levels to a DIN level of 0.8 by 2030, if that is to be achieved. The RWSS cannot legally be held responsible for the actions or the nitrogen contributions to in-stream of those other parties. In our view, the board has recognised this in requiring only that the land supplied by the RWSS, as set out in Condition 12A, be managed in a manner consistent with achieving that target. As we've already traversed, the RWSS activities won't commence until 2019 or 2020 when water is supplied. And even assuming that there's a rapid movement of nitrogen from the soil into surface waterways, our advice is that it's unlikely that Condition 12A will be triggered much before 2025. Well, I guess we acknowledge that it could, in some circumstances, be triggered before that if there were a very substantial increase. And that is because, in the point I made in response to Councillor Barker, the 5-year rolling mean DIN will not be solely or mainly reflecting RWSS land activities until some date close to 2025. And that is the measure for the test in Condition 11C. It was traversed earlier that there are significant time lags in the delivery of nitrogen from the root zone into the rivers. And the Board of Inquiry itself has acknowledged that, using the wording, I think, decades to perhaps up to 100 years, at paragraph 382 of its final decision in 2014. If you take those two factors into account, both the requirement for a 5-year rolling DIN and the possible time lag of years or decades, it's possible that Condition 12A will not be triggered before 2030. We don't know how likely that is, but it's possible. So we've considered scenarios a little like what Councillor Bevan has drawn up, because we wanted to understand for ourselves if Condition 12A was triggered, then what specific actions might need to be taken, and could the RWSS operator live with those actions? Because that's a practical definition of what workable means. So we considered a first scenario, an easy one essentially. So at a single point, somewhere in the catchment with not too many farms upstream of it, it turns out that, yes, there's been an increase in the DIN levels, and it's been considered that they pass the whatever test you want to pass to accept that there's a material contribution being made, and now specific activities have to be identified and communicated to the farmers and to the council. The second is for a much larger scale material contribution threshold being triggered. So in the first case, we've taken the view that there's a range of increasingly stringent, if you like, management actions that could be taken, specific actions that could be taken. The first of those, just to give you an example, might be to say, well, actually within the conditions, the RWSS is allowed to average the root zone leaching losses over the whole of each water management zone. you might say, well, actually we should only average them over the bit that's upstream from here. That'd be a reasonable thing to do if the bit that's upstream from the measuring point was actually being allowed to emit a bit more than some other places in the zone because unders and overs were allowed. If that were the case, you'd say, well, an obvious specific action would be to require all the properties upstream of that measuring point only to be averaged over that specific area. In a next logical step after that might be to say, well, actually we're going to require each individual farm to live within the LUC leaching limits on its own area of farmland. That's another specific action. And then there's a whole bunch of management practices as well. So we think that's entirely feasible and workable.
Sorry, can you just explain this overs and unders thing again?
So part of the conditions of the RWSS is that it is allowed to average the LUC leaching rates over each of 3 large water management zones. So it is allowed to do overs and unders between individual farms or farm enterprises. Ordinary farmers with a resource consent for a particular enterprise are allowed to average over their property, but not more broadly. And they can't, as I understand it, they can't get together unless they've got a business arrangement, which would make it a farm enterprise. They can't get together to average more broadly than their individual property. But the RWSS is able to average over the whole of each water management zone. That is a condition.
Right, so that's across the RWSS farmers, not across the entire
No,
farming
just across
community.
across those who are being supplied by the RWSS. So unders and overs might mean that upstream of here, previously you've been letting people emit a bit more than they might otherwise have been allowed to emit. If that were the case, and again, turning to Mr. Conway's description that you have to determine what you're going to do in a specific set of circumstances, taking that set of circumstances into account, then you might say, well, no, we're not going to let these guys, carry more of the nitrogen emission or average. We're going to require them in the catchment area above this point to live within the limits on average. Or you might say, the operator might say, they're going to have to actually average on a farm or a farm enterprise basis. And that's a specific action that could be taken, and if you decided that that didn't get you enough reduction, then you'd have to tighten up on other management practices. We think that's entirely workable. If you like, that's a bookend to the range of specific actions that you might have to take at the lowest level of specific actions. Again, we think our view of that is supported by Mr. Conway's paragraph 37 in his first sentence. I won't bother to read that out to you. In the second scenario, we've taken a well downstream measuring point that is currently significantly above the DIN and said, well, what's the worst case scenario we can think of for this area? Well, something approaching the worst case scenario would be to say, well, first of all, condition 12A is triggered right on day 1. There's no time lag. There's no messing around with 5-year moving averages. You've got a problem on day 1, as soon as water's being delivered, or as soon as you get the first monthly sample after water being delivered. The second element of that worst case scenario is to say that a very large fraction of the total area that's being supplied is upstream of that point. In the case that we've worked through is to say, well, there's 25,000 hectares of RWSS land upstream of that measuring point. That's essentially nearly the whole of the RWSS. So we've made this a pretty stringent scenario. Then we've said, so how much nitrogen is allowed to be emitted over the whole of the catchment above that measuring point by all of the land users if they emitted at their LUC leaching rates? In what fraction of that total is allowed to be emitted by the RWSS land users on the land, on the 25,000 hectares that they're occupying? And we've made it a further worst case scenario by saying that all of the RWSS land is in that 25,000 hectares is on the highest land use capability class, which has the largest LUC leaching rates. So that's the largest fraction that you could get of the total amount of nitrogen that's allowed to be emitted upstream at this point using the land use capability class emission limits. And that turns out to be about 35% or 37% of the total amount of nitrogen that's allowed to be emitted amongst all of the parties, even though at 25,000 hectares in this case, the RWSS would be occupying about 19% of the catchment area because it's got the higher quality soils with the higher emission rates. We've then said, so if it's 35% or 37%, then given that this catchment is already over-allocated, is the correct term, it has more DIN passing the measurement point than it's allowed to have. Well, how much DIN is passing that measurement point, and what would 37% of it be, which is the amount of reduction that the RWSS should have to absorb in order to get it back down to a DIN of 0.8? Well, the answer in this case is there's 158,000 kilograms of nitrogen per year, and essentially 58,000 of those need to be absorbed by the RWSS. Because this gets triggered on day one, you've got 10 years in which to absorb that and get down. The bottom line of this is that over that 10 years, the RWSS land users would need to be below their LUC emitting permitted leaching rates by around 3 kilograms per hectare over the whole of the 10 years, by 1/3 of a kilogram per hectare per year if you reduce that down. That's about 1% below the LUC rates reduction each year for 10 years. We think that's entirely workable with continuous improvement in best management practices.
Dr. Pearce, I might stop you there. I'm just wondering what's your time frame? We normally break now for lunch for 30 minutes, and these people.
Can I do the last of the conditions, the last of the things?
You can do,
we're
but
there.
I'm just with your indulgence, we might break for 25 minutes and come back. That's all. After you do that.
After P?
Yeah, because I'm sure there are other
down
questions.
To P.
I'm sure
there's
there are
bound
other
to be questions.
Yeah, around other aspects.
Yes. In P, and again this has been traversed earlier, our view is that condition 12A on its face is expressed in a manner where it effectively ceases to operate after the 31st of December 2030. Mr. Conway has attempted, I think, to infer the mind of the board, but that's inconsistent with his own advice to you that says they have to be read on the face of the conditions in his paragraph 9. In the guts of our logic here is that the wording of condition 12A says you have to identify specific actions to be taken that will be consistent with achieving the DIN limit by the 31st of December 2030. No specific action taken on the 1st of January 2031 or any date after that is physically or logically capable of making a difference to whether or not the target is achieved by midnight on the 31st of December 2030. That is why it effectively ceases at that date. Irrespective of that, there will be a plan change by 2025. There has to be. to bring everything into compliance with the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management 2014. This whole set of limits, conditions and so on and so forth in the plan will be reviewed and through a public process by then. But I would say also that whatever happens as a consequence of that plan change can't do things that would make the RWSS consents unusable, that would frustrate those consents. We have already publicly committed to setting in place a framework of monitoring MCI. We want to be ready, actually, for when that comes, and it will come. The NOF framework is already about to adopt that. The Parliamentary Commissioner says it's the right thing we should do. And in fact, the Board of Inquiry itself, its whole reasoning starts from saying, in order to give effect to the National Policy Statement, you must regulate for ecosystem health. It also said, everybody agrees that the correct measure of ecosystem health is the MCI. It went a step further than that. It said everyone's pretty much in agreement about what the score of an MCI is that makes the difference between being good or not good. It's a score of 100. It then went on to use a surrogate for the DIN, and it said that the science here is interim and water quality science and standards and measures may change in the future. And so whether there's a DIN limit or what will be a matter to be determined in that subsequent plan change. I'm happy to take questions, Mr. Chairman, but I'm also happy to go for lunch and deal with questions after.
I think we might just break for lunch. Back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. And we'll get through the rest of your paper and deal with the port revaluation.
Sure.